In 1810, the emperor ordered the notes concerning several people in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, whose removal Fouché had demanded, which were in the offices of the Ministry of Police, to be laid before him. He was surprised at the trifling nature of the complaints made against them, and ordered that these persons should be recalled from exile. 4 or 5 of them alone were accepted from his amnesty, amongst others Madame de Chevreuse and Staël, whom Napoleon knew personally and whose malicious way of talking displeased him. One of them was in constant conspiracy against his authority. The other was of an irremediably hostile disposition, the emperor deeming them incorrigible, as well as Madame Récamier, one of Madame de Staël's henchwomen, forbade them to live in Paris in the strictest terms without assigning limits of time to this ostracism. On the same occasion, Napoleon wished to inform himself what the real state of affairs in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, which certain persons, from prejudice or by interest, tried to make him look upon as a bogey. He ordered information accordingly to be supplied of influential families who were known for their active opposition or for their harmless sulking against the new order of things. I drew up a kind of dictionary with this purpose in view by help of the contradictory notes supplied by Messieurs de Talleyrand, Semonville, de Rock, and the Minister of Police. But I do not think that the emperor ever consulted it, and it has since remained in my hands. I have related above with what hesitation Napoleon separated himself from Fouché, in spite of the fact that there were reasons for complaint against him, which were only too well founded, and this in consideration of the useful services which he had rendered him, especially at the time of his accession to power. Bourrienne was another example of that feeling of instinctive benevolence which attached Napoleon to anybody who could invoke old times before him. This benevolence, this remembrance of services rendered in an elevated sphere, extended to the most modest posts in his household. No old servant was ever dismissed until the emperor had approved of the report addressed to him on this subject, and it was only on the 2nd or 3rd relapse that he agreed to a dismissal. A poor devil of a coachman, whose constant state of intoxication rendered him incapable of doing his work, escaped being dismissed for a long time because he had driven a wagon at the Battle of Marengo. The first usher of the emperor's cabinet, a man called Landois, whom the emperor liked and whose old and faithful services he appreciated, having lost his wife, desired on account of family affairs to remarry his wife's sister. Such marriages were forbidden by the civil code. The emperor, to whom Landois applied, told him that it was impossible for him to grant him this request, but vanquished by the pressing demands of the man, Napoleon charged the grand judge to make a report to him of the matter. The conclusions of the minister's report were to the effect that although the person whom Landois wished to marry was only his wife's half-sister, the prohibition was so formal that the emperor could not authorize the marriage without committing a flagrant violation of the law. Napoleon sympathized with his servant's grief and had it suggested to him to go and marry in some neighboring state which was outside of the jurisdiction of the civil code. Landois could only get married in 1814, when marriages of this kind ceased to be absolutely forbidden. If the examples of Napoleon's goodness were limited to those which I have just quoted, they would not be conclusive in favor of the natural kindness of his disposition. There is no tyrant, however savage he may be deemed to be, who has not his good moments. What I wanted to say was that this kindness was the usual state of his mind, and that it was practiced on every opportunity. Even when Napoleon had thought it his duty to reprimand severely, his real disposition got the upper hand, and sooner or later made amends for any injustice in what he had said. I do not want to digress too far, nor to mention the numerous examples of Napoleon's disposition to remember past services. These examples are generally well known, and I will content myself with mentioning the following, which are less so. In 1809, General Carnot found himself in debt. Since Napoleon's accession to the empire, he had constantly maintained an attitude of pronounced hostility towards the new regime. As this general's conduct was the result of his convictions and not of personal feeling, he presumed on the sovereign's generosity to the extent of asking his support in a critical moment, and accordingly sent me, through the agency of Monsieur Collignon, his kinsman, with whom I had been in relations, a letter in which he asked me to ask the emperor for a loan of a sufficient sum to settle his difficulties. The emperor, being touched by Carnot's confidence in him, hastened to assist him. By a delicate feeling, he did not ask to be informed of the state of the general's affairs, nor did he ask him to lay his accounts before him. Napoleon simply asked the Minister of War at what time Carnot had ceased to receive his pay as a general, and ordered the arrears with accessories to be paid over to him, which realized more than Carnot needed for his debts. At the same time, he granted him a pension of 10,000 francs as a former minister. Carnot, out of gratitude for the emperor's generosity towards him, offered him his services. An exchange of courtesies then took place between them, which honors them both alike. Napoleon, out of consideration for Carnot's political convictions, did not wish to assign him to a post the duties of which might clash with his opinions. He asked him purely and simply to write a book on the defense of fortified places, inviting him to give the authority of his name to the principle of defense carried to its extremest limits. Recent examples had shown the necessity of reestablishing this principle. Carnot lost no time in carrying out the emperor's wishes, and a few months later sent him the work, together with the following letter. Sire, not having been able to offer your majesty the first copy of my work on the defense of fortified places with my own hands, I have begged His Excellency, the Minister of War, to present it to you in my name. My best endeavors have been used in this book to point out to young soldiers intended for this branch of the service the true path of duty, and to inspire them with the feelings of honor and of devotion to your person with which they should be animated. I personally have been guided in the course of my work by my feeling of profound gratitude towards you. May this feeling supplement the talent which I should have needed to carry out your wishes in a worthy manner. I am, sire, your majesty's very humble and very obedient servant and faithful subject. Signed, Carnot. Later on, in 1814, when misfortune fell upon France, and the importance of our fortified places was increased by the invasion of the territory, Carnot offered Napoleon the assistance of his sword and of his experience in a touching letter. His offer having been accepted, he was sent to Antwerp, where he added example to the precept which he had so wisely and so eloquently expounded. Chenier, having become the adversary of the emperor, whom he even attacked in his writings, applied nonetheless to him for a post which he needed. As I had known him formerly, it was through me that his letter reached its destination. After Chenier left the tribunate, the first consul had offered him the place of administrator of the post office. It was a kind of sinecure which would have enabled Chenier to give himself up to his literary work. Such occupations were better suited for him and would, without doubt, have replaced in a profitable and advantageous manner the systematic opposition which had won for him in the tribunate the empty shadow of the influence which he had formerly exercised in the heart of the convention and of the popular assemblies. Chenier refused this lucrative post, although he was fond of spending money, and combined republican ideas with a little aristocratic display. He proudly wished to earn the salary of the place given to him. He asked for the place of university inspector, a place which was more suited to his tastes and aptitude, and in spite of the wretched state of his health, courageously undertook a long tour on the inspection of schools. His vanity as a poet, which could brook no contradiction, often made him forget that the spirit of conciliation was necessary in the functions which he fulfilled. A spirit of opposition, the recollection of his former political passions, led him on to indiscreet attacks against the power of the head of the state. On a report from Fouché, who until then had been his protector, the place of university inspector was withdrawn from him. Financial embarrassment indeed. A state of real distress, to which he was reduced by the loss of his occupation, got the better of his pride. Palissot, who liked him very much, persuaded him after a long resistance to appeal to the emperor's generosity, and assured him that I would willingly undertake to place his letter before the sovereign's eyes. On reading his letter, Napoleon was touched by the sad position into which a man whose talents he respected had fallen, and he made haste to hand over to the poet a sum of money which he needed to pay his debts. At the same time, he commissioned him to continue the history of France and entrusted him with other literary work, rewarding him with a handsome salary. Chenier did not enjoy this new favor for any great length of time, for death overtook him in the prime of life and at the moment when his talents had reached their greatest height. Charles Pugin, an estimable literary man and a member of the Institute, had had the misfortune to lose his sight. This state of blindness had not, however, interrupted him in his literary work. Deprived of all resources by the events of the Revolution, he had succeeded in establishing a printing office to which he had added a bookseller's shop. He had been known to General Bonaparte, whose library he had formed at the time of his departure for Egypt. A series of bankruptcies ruined Pugin in 1803. In his distress, it occurred to him to apply to the first consul, who at that time happened to be at the camp of Boulogne. The courier who had carried Monsieur Pugin's letter returned with an order that 40,000 francs were to be advanced to him. This loan was to be paid back in a period of 4 years. 10 years later, half this sum was still owing, but touched by the energy of his debtor's efforts and by his honesty, Napoleon discharged him of the 20,000 francs which remained owing in a decision issued April 10th, 1813. It was stated in this decision that this favor was granted to Monsieur Pugin in compensation for the suppression of his printing office and as a reward for the labors which he was carrying out for the achievement of his great work, Le Trésor des Origines, the treasure of origins, the complete publication of which was prevented by the author's death. Pugin was only able to print one specimen in folio, which shows immense erudition and research, really surprising when one considers that the author had lost his sight. It would be easy to quote other examples and numerous proofs of Napoleon's liberality as well as of the delicacy which he employed in his way of obliging. Without referring again to his munificence towards his generals, I am in a position to say that his ministers, senators, and many other civil functionaries enjoyed the benefits of a generosity to which those who were worthy of it never appealed in vain. I had asked the emperor for a pension on the Empire Press Fund in favor of my old friend Palissot. I haggled with him for a long time as to the amount of this pension. He did not want it to exceed 3,000 francs, although he had quite recently awarded a pension of 6,000 francs to the poet Lebrun. Et Couchard. We had a kind of discussion in which Napoleon consented to engage with me on the respective merits of the two poets. He authorized me to prepare for him a draft decree granting Palissot a pension, but only one of 3,000 francs. As he very readily put up with being contradicted on questions which only interested him slightly, and indeed very often gave way on these points, I told him that since he consented to give my protege a pension, I could not make this amount less than 6,000 francs in the decree which I should prepare for him for his signature. He answered nothing. But when I laid the decree before him, Napoleon cried out. Turning round towards me, he caught hold of my ear. which was a familiar gesture of his, and reproached me, laughing, at having wanted to get his signature by surprise. Then, laying down his pen, he repeated his objections on the inferiority of Palissot's merit as compared with Lebrun. At last, after jesting with me in a kindly manner on my tenacity, he was good enough to compound with me and to award a pension of 4,000 francs to my worthy friend, who enjoyed it until his death, which took place just at the time when the Restoration was about to deprive him of his pension. Napoleon is supposed to have been incapable of friendship. Hatred, which has worked with such assiduity to disfigure this great character, could not fail to seek to strip him of the most precious attribute of true greatness. Napoleon had sincere friends, whose friendship he often requited: Desaix, Lannes, Duroc, Bessières, Miron, and others whose names are not before my memory just now. Misfortune is a crucible in which friendship is refined and often dissolved. But the friends whom I have named were profoundly attached to Napoleon and would have remained faithful to him, as he, on his side, was to their memory. The interest which Napoleon took in those whom he loved proves that he was capable of attachment. A general officer whom he had adopted from the moment of his entering the military profession, whom he had supported and guided with particular interest, and to whom he had given the most favorable opportunity of distinguishing himself in war, had just been raised to the highest dignity in the army. The Duc de Ragusa, after having received his nomination as marshal, presented himself in the emperor's tent to thank him. Napoleon said, "I have given you your nomination, and I had great pleasure in giving you this new proof of my affection, but I am afraid I may have incurred the reproach of having listened rather to my affection than your rights to this eminent distinction. You have plenty of intelligence, but there are needed for war qualities in which you are still lacking, and which you must work to acquire. Be it said amongst ourselves that you have not done enough to entirely justify my choice. At the same time, I am confident that I shall have reason to congratulate myself on having nominated you, and that you will justify me in the eyes of the army." The man to whom these words were addressed, touched by such paternal feeling, agreed as to what he owed to the emperor's goodness, and protested that it was his intention to render himself altogether worthy of it, and to give him fresh proofs of his devotion. I did not mention Berthier's name amongst the emperor's friends because of his defection in 1814, and I was wrong. If a moment of error separated this marshal from the emperor at that time, Berthier had preserved too deeply rooted a remembrance of his old master not to survive adversity. I very nearly met the Prince of Wagram at Waldsee, a town in Württemberg, in 1815, when, like a plant which turns its face towards the orb from the rays of which it derives its existence, Berthier was on his way to join the person whom he called his brother in arms, his faithful companion in war, his wife. The emperor, on his side, could not forgive him. He used to say laughingly that when Berthier returned, and Napoleon never doubted that Berthier would return, he would take no other revenge upon him than to oblige him to come to the Tuileries in the uniform of Louis XVIII's guards. We may be quite sure that the emperor would not have insisted on this. Adversity, moreover, drew close to Napoleon. At St. Helena, men whose devotion he would never have had the full opportunity of judging in the days of his prosperity, and amongst these it is right with others to mention the name of Monsieur de las Casas, in whose sympathy and fidelity the illustrious captive found consolation in his exile. Napoleon's feelings towards his courtier under misfortune are shown in a letter which is a monument of true friendship, which the emperor wrote to his faithful servant when England forced him to leave Longwood. Monsieur de las Casas responded to these feelings by publishing a book which, in spite of its faults, became and will remain popular.